online.
Terrific.
So let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean Waterbury, and I'm the Director of Community and Regional Projects at the Tuthill Commission in Watertown. Thank you for participating in today's webinar on the new public employer mandatory emergency planning requirement. Our speaker today is Tim Riecker, partner and principal consultant with Emergency Preparedness Solutions located in the Utica area. Tim has a multifaceted public safety career spanning over 2 decades, working as a local emergency response chief officer, senior staff for the state's emergency management office, and as a consultant across North America. He has participated in the management of 21 presidentially declared disasters. He holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from SUNY Oswego and is a certified emergency disaster professional. He is presently engaged with over 24 municipalities across the state, developing plans to meet the requirements of this new law. The Commission would like to thank Tim for agreeing to do this session today. Thanks, Tim. Just one housekeeping item. Please use the chat to ask any questions you have, and we will get to them either during the webinar or at the end. We hope you find this presentation informative. And again, thank you for your participation. Tim, with that, I will turn it over to you to start the webinar.
Terrific. Well, Jean, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for joining us here to talk about a law. That's really exciting. Hopefully, I'll be able to keep everyone awake as we get through this. Also, hoping that everyone is healthy and doing well and enjoying their holiday season the best way possible. Certainly know that things even for my own family have been very different through the pandemic, as I'm sure they have been for all of you. So getting on with this law here, this is something that was signed by the governor back on Labor Day, and it has kept us pretty busy for the last few months. Even since I provided the brief bio there for Jean, it doesn't matter how brief I make those things; they're always like embarrassingly long. We've even picked up some more folks around the state that we're working with on this requirement. So working with quite a number of cities, towns, and villages around the state, and they're in varying degrees of the project. So about 1/3 of them are done. We have another 1/3 where we have basically first drafts that are done and they're being reviewed by the municipality, and then another 1/3 where we're in some form of development. Either we're waiting on information from the municipality or they are in the planning queue. And we have a few plans that we're actually in the midst of working on right now. So we are chugging through these quite a bit. So I do like to throw a few disclaimers up there, just so everyone has a good understanding of where I'm coming from with this and what my perspective is with this type of thing. Now, we are talking about a law, but I am not an attorney. That said, I've talked to an awful lot of attorneys as we have kind of gone through this law. And these are legal counsels for some of the state legislators that have been involved in this, for the State Association of Towns, the Conference of Mayors, as well as a private attorney who actually does a lot of emergency services type of legal work. And so we've looked at this quite a bit. We've picked apart a few things. Certainly, as I've gone through a few of these presentations, we have had certain questions. So I've made sure to get some of that information into the presentation to make sure that we cover it the best way we can. Also, yes, absolutely welcome questions to come from folks at any point through this. Some of the earlier presentations I did on this had around 400 people. And so I had to really kind of contain very specific time periods for questions, because otherwise there was no way we were going to get through it. But I think with this group, this is a nice sized group. I can pretty much take questions at any point through this. If it's topical, there might be some times where I say, hey, we're going to get to that. So I'll answer that question then. There also might be some times where you might have a very, very specific question about circumstances of your town or village relative to this, that so many things in emergency planning are very, very situationally dependent. And I might not be able to give a really definitive answer on those things. So I will certainly try my best. If it's something that requires like way too much detail or context to get into, then I'll let you know. Yeah, having been doing this for a couple of decades, I can say that I've seen and done an awful lot, but never everything and anything. Whenever you think you know a lot about a disaster, the next time it happens, something will change and pretty considerably. So yeah, there's that disclaimer there. Also, my opinions don't necessarily represent those of the Tug Hill Commission. They did not ask me to say that. I like to put that out there. I can be kind of opinionated. Especially when it comes to doing this, I have been doing it long enough where I do have some opinions on things. Nothing that's really outrageous or anything, but I always try to make sure to protect people with that. And also, as with any law, this law can be amended. So the information I'm providing is current as of right now. And as far as I know right now, this law has not been amended from its original state. So that's the information that I'm putting out there. Obviously, if it's amended and it changes, then whatever information that you get from this has to change appropriately in accordance with that. So basically, our agenda here, we're going to do a review of this law. Yes, I do have kind of a designated stopping point for questions, but as I said, you can ask questions at any point throughout here. Put those right in the chat, and folks will have that moderated for me. Then I'm going to talk about some planning guidance. Again, based on my experiences, based on existing standards that are out there for emergency planning, I'll provide you with some resources, which includes those standards, as well as some stuff that we as a company have provided. I'm a New Yorker. Aside from about, I don't know, a little over a year living in Massachusetts, mostly in Boston, I've always been a New Yorker. I've lived in various places around the state, but even as a company, we do work all around the continent. But I saw this with this law coming out, and knowing that especially a lot of small towns would probably need some assistance with this, we leaned forward into this, and we provided some resources on our website for it. So I'll talk a little bit about those resources when we get to that spot. So the law. So for those of you who actually want to get a copy of the law, Senate Bill 8617B is your resource for putting into your search engine of choice. That will give you the full text of the law. As I mentioned, this was signed on Labor Day. And overall, this law requires public employers. So it's cities, towns, villages, authorities, public corporations, counties, even state agencies are bound to do this. So they need to create these plans, and the focus of these is to protect employees and contractors in the event of another public health emergency declaration in New York State. So this is something, while we will reference through this presentation, and even in some instances when I write the plans, we're making references to the current pandemic. That's because these are kind of the best standards that we have. Pandemics, thankfully, don't happen very often. And this one has been the one, while we have had a few pandemics over the last few decades, this one is the most prominent. And this is one that has created a lot of laws, a lot of standards, a lot of practices that we can reference as such. That said, 7 years from now, if there's a H5N22 pandemic, whatever that is, we have to recognize that the standards that exist now and the practices that exist now for this pandemic may or may not apply to that one. And a lot of the laws that have been created for the coronavirus pandemic are only for the coronavirus pandemic. So we just have to make sure that we contextualize those things. This is a plan that is supposed to live in perpetuity. So we have to be aware of that when we talk about this. Also, this particular law largely amends New York State labor law. As such, it is under, specifically because we're dealing with government entities, public employers, it's under the auspices of PESH, the Public Employer Safety and Health portion of the State Department of Labor. There is no particular provision in this law for like enforcement or auditing or anything like that, but maybe. PESH holds the authority to do that for anything that's in New York State labor law for public employers. So they certainly, I don't see what would prevent them from doing so in regard to this law either. There is also a provision in this law that does apply to school districts. And that basically takes all the provisions of this law and it tells school districts, hey, you have to be sure to address this stuff in your school safety plans. That's really all it is. So that does amend state education law to that extent. So who's impacted? As I said, it's every level of government in New York State. We look at authorities and public benefit corporations. We deal with a lot of those, water authorities, bridge authorities, airport authorities, transit authorities, various types of districts that are set up for certain things, up to and including fire districts. Now, I'll talk a little bit about those in a bit. As I mentioned, school districts are included, but that's a particular thing through state education law. So fire protection organizations, New York state law tries to make things as complex as absolutely possible in regard to fire protection services. There are a variety of different ways that, quote, fire departments, and I mean that in the generalist terms, can organize. So we have fire departments, fire companies, and fire protection districts. Those are governed by or contracted to a municipality. So with that, they are the responsibility of the municipality. So for example, my town here, I'm in the town of Schuyler in the Mohawk Valley in Herkimer County. We have a fire company. We have the Schuyler Volunteer Fire Company. They are an independent organization. They work as a contractor to my town, fundamentally. They're given a budget every single year. They have a contract that says these are the services that you're going to provide. And as a contractor, because contractors are included in this law specifically, the town's plan needs to provide for them. Same thing with cities. Cities will have fire departments. They are a part of city government. When it comes specifically to fire districts, though, fire districts are self-governed. So they have their fire commissioners, and they have their own taxing authority and all that kind of stuff. So they are independently responsible to meet this requirement. The vast majority of the towns that we are working with for this around the state have fire districts. So they basically don't have any, the towns themselves don't have any responsibility for this. When we're writing the plans, we're acknowledging those fire districts, but we aren't including them in the plan. So another unique thing is courts. The law itself, as with fire protection, doesn't specify anything in regard to courts, but courts are part of local government. But another caveat, they are largely overseen by OCA, the Office of Court Administration. And probably a lot of you experienced this earlier in the pandemic. OCA actually shut down courts for the better part of 2 months. Then they said, okay, you can reopen, but here's all the protective measures that you have to put in place, the procedures you have to have. They sent them PPE, they did all sorts of stuff. We're still including courts in the plan because they are a part of local government. They are budgeted by local government. Their personnel are provided by local government. Their facilities are provided by local government. That said, we do have to acknowledge the fact that they basically also serve another master, and what they may be directed to do by OCA might not be what the government entity, the local government entity, is doing. So how we address that in the plan is that we basically make that statement that acknowledges that, and we say, okay, these two sides are going to work together. They're simply going to coordinate and make sure that everyone's on the same page. You don't also have to be doing the same thing, but they at least have to have some awareness of what they're doing. You know, I know that a lot of jurisdictions, again, very similar to my town here, where town court hearings are actually conducted in town hall in the same meeting room that's used for town board meetings and that kind of stuff. So they truly are an integrated part. It's a rare occasion that we find separate courthouses unless we're in a city. So the intent of this law, as I said, a lot of lessons have been learned from the coronavirus pandemic, and this law tries to address a lot of the identified preparedness gaps. The plan that this law requires is very much unlike any other kind of plan that we see in terms of emergency management, emergency preparedness. So your jurisdiction might have an emergency operations plan or a comprehensive emergency management plan. I can pretty much guarantee that it does not meet all the provisions that are required in this law. You may even have a continuity of operations plan or a continuity of government plan. A couple of those elements might actually be in that plan, but again, I can pretty much guarantee not all of them. It's very, very focused on public worker safety and has very specific provisions. So even if you have existing plans, you got to do this one. The other side of this, I've been asked by folks, well, gee, can we just kind of put the content of this required plan into our existing emergency operations plan or continuity of government plan or whatever? I strongly advise against that. Very often when you have a plan that is required by a law or regulation, I like to keep those separate. They may reference other plans, but if you keep them as a separate document, it makes it a lot easier to reference, a lot easier to update. And in the event of some kind of an audit, whoever is doing that audit can look at the plan, they can look at the law, and basically work down through each of them in order and see that everything is there and that everything is lining up in terms of meeting those requirements. If you're putting bits and pieces here and there and everywhere to try to fit it into your existing plan, it's not as neat and tidy as it really should be. So plan requirements. There's a number of things that the plan requires for us here. So first of all, identifying a list of positions that are considered essential. There's a couple of important definitions that the law provides here and that we also specifically define those in the plan. First of all, we're talking about essential. We're talking about any position whose duties need to actually be performed on site. We know from this pandemic that a lot of jurisdictions had personnel who were working remotely, maybe 3 or 4 days a week, but they were in the office 1 or 2 days a week to get mail, to have some in-person meetings, appointments, that kind of stuff, things that they couldn't necessarily do remotely. In terms of our plan, we're still regarding those folks as essential because their presence in whole or in part is still being required in the office. When we talk about positions, and any time through this presentation where I say positions, staff, employees, whatever, the law is defining positions as both employees and contractors. Now, when it comes to contractors, we're talking those kind of long-term engagement contractors. So again, it could be a fire company. That's definitely a long-term engagement type of a contractor. We're not talking a contractor like someone who comes in to fix your printer. very, very transient thing. They're in there for 15 minutes or 15 hours, depending on how complex that repair is. But then that's it. They're gone. You're probably not going to see them again until the next problem comes in. A lot of towns will have cleaning personnel who are contractors. They maybe come in once or twice a week. Yes, that's someone who would be included in this. They are a regular contractor. They have a regular appearance. Bookkeepers are another one. A lot of smaller towns will have a bookkeeper. Sometimes they're working remotely. Sometimes they do have a physical presence, in town hall once or twice a week. That's the type of contractor that would be included in this. So it also requires protocols for facilitating and enabling remote work. Those are for the, quote, non-essential employees. Having worked for government for over a decade, I despise even the concept that we can say that an employee is non-essential, but that is how this plan is defining them. Essential being on-site, non-essential being off-site. So that is something that I'm just not thrilled with that definition, but it's what we have to work with. And then a description of how that employer could stagger work shifts. And we found a lot of towns have been doing staggered work shifts. If they had, more than a handful of personnel, oftentimes someone would come in earlier and then someone else would come in later in the day. Maybe there would be a little bit of overlap of their work, but it's essentially to kind of promote social distancing, particularly if they're sharing a workspace, and to basically kind of avoid that stuff as much as possible.
Tim,
yes,
we have a question. Does the municipality have to list the contractors?
So yeah, that's a good question. That is something that we have been doing if they are essential. So again, plan requirement being to list the positions that are considered essential. Among those positions are employees or contractors. So yes, if there's a bookkeeper who is a contractor and you regard them as essential, then yes, they should be in that list. Also, no names. No names. That names and phone numbers and email addresses are plan killers. Those are fine if you want to include those as an attachment to the plan, but it pains me tremendously to read through a plan and find very often that names, phone numbers, email addresses, unless they're like, a static, like this is the phone number for the county emergency services office. We know that phone number is probably never going to change. But, phone numbers associated with people and that kind of stuff, email addresses associated with individuals, those types of things that they can make a plan obsolete the next day. And if a plan is not looked at and reviewed and updated regularly, and someone is not aware of those changes, that then really compromises your plan. So keep things to positions when we do planning. And I'm sure I reinforce that again somewhere later on in this presentation. Let's see the next requirement in here. Protocols for procurement, storage, and distribution of personal protective equipment, PPE. We also are recommending to include things like hand sanitizer, cleaning supplies and equipment in there as well, just because we've seen, one, how necessary those types of things are, and especially in regard to the supply chain. We've seen those things be compromised, particularly earlier on in the pandemic, where getting any kind of disinfectant from a retail vendor was really challenging. Getting PPE from a retail vendor was very challenging to do as well. So basically what the law wants you to do is to have some quantity on hand. They do not define how much. They want you to have some kind of plan for procurement. And generally what we're advising is, okay, retail vendors, you don't even have to necessarily name them because, of course, again, especially if you have purchasing contracts, that kind of stuff, that stuff is transient. It could change every 1, 2, 3 years. So you can kind of just generally say whatever your vendors are. If you have pre-identified vendors, otherwise you go to whoever. And then as a secondary option is then to go to generally the next level of government. So for probably everyone who's on this, that would be the county. So going to county, whatever your specific emergency services or emergency management office is called, and or your health department. Those are probably good sources for it. I know a lot of folks got stuff directly from the state, not necessarily how the emergency management system always works. In New York State, it tends to go from state to county to local municipality. So that's kind of how we couch it in the plan. Protocols for employee exposures to whatever the disease du jour is, or employees who are exhibiting symptoms consistent with that disease. So basically, how are you going to handle that stuff? Again, we've learned a lot from the coronavirus pandemic that we can include in there. And a lot of you have probably been doing this and dealing with it, but chances are it's not actually captured in writing. So this is an opportunity to say, okay, what have we been doing? Does it work? Is it good? And let's actually put it in writing. Of course, when we put things in writing, we can then see, oh, this is a gap. So how do we address it? How do we fix it? And I'm very big that when we put things in writing, we are identifying who the decision makers are. So who needs to be notified of something occurring, then what are they going to do with that? They're making a decision based on that. They're directing someone to do something. And then who's that someone? Who's the action agent who's actually responsible for handling it? In some cases, that's all the same person. In other cases, it's, the town supervisor is the decision maker, but the town clerk is the action agent. Or for a lot of towns, we're kind of seeing it bifurcated, where like the clerk will handle things in town hall, but the highway superintendent is handling things for the highway department. And basically whatever works. I'm a very, very practical planner. And so I like to capture and identify in a plan what actually will work. I mean, there's no sense in going through this type of activity to come out with a document that is not practical or reasonable for you to actually use. And I think that if there were to ever be an audit of a document like this, I think that would be one big thing. Certainly when I review emergency plans, I look at it from that perspective of practicality and, okay, the plan says you're going to do A, but are you really? Can you really? If it seems too unwieldy, then maybe not. Now, this would also include some protocols for cleaning and disinfection, which we know is a big issue in our workspaces. Also to include vehicles. So not just your own workplaces and desks and common areas, but also consider vehicles, as well as leave policies, which have been another thing. And in New York State, we pretty much have a law right now in place that's guiding us and telling us what it is that we need to do. But they are looking at not necessarily a policy to be included in the plan. Plans are kind of quasi-policy, but plans should also never be written in concrete because we don't know the complete context of the next disaster that we're going to face. So we need to have a lot of flexibility in that plan. Plans should provide really good guidance, but also allow us to exit off of that guidance if the disaster doesn't line up with the plan. So they are looking for protocols in terms of leave and how you would do that. And we are basing a lot of that on the current Coronavirus Leave Act. Let's see, also protocols for supporting contact tracing efforts. And this is through documentation of work hours and locations for all personnel. This is not time and attendance. And especially for those of you who have labor unions, and there's a very specific role for labor unions that we're going to talk about in a little bit relative to this law. Punching a time clock or writing in a timesheet is not this. This is actually documenting when you are where. For a lot of you and a lot of your staff, that may not be a big deal. They come into town hall at 7:30 in the morning, they leave at, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's it. They're only in town hall. They don't go anyplace else. Others might be bouncing from building to building. So you want to make sure that you're tracking this. And this is only for your personnel. This is not for tracking the public. have had a lot of folks ask about, hey, should we be keeping tabs on the public who comes into our building? Should we, get their name and their contact information? Yes, I certainly think that during a public health emergency, we should, because that does help to identify if you had an exposure or potential exposure in town hall on a certain day at a certain time, you can then see who else was there. And I think it's kind of a civic responsibility that we have, not only protecting our employees, but also taking care of the folks who visit us. That said, this plan is only for our personnel. We're not really addressing anything with the public for this. And it's only for public health emergencies. We're also not addressing anything outside of the realm of public health emergencies in this.
Tim, can I interrupt for a second? There was another question in the chat from
Sure.
Norm Paradise. He's from the town of Worth. The town of Worth and the town of Lorraine share a justice court. So the court only meets in the town of Lorraine, but is serving both town of Worth and town of Lorraine. He's wondering if both towns have to address that court or just Lorraine, since that's where it actually physically happens.
So that's a good question, and that's a pretty unique circumstance. My recommendation, kind of at first blush on that, would be it would really be Lorraine's responsibility if that's where the court physically resides. However, the other town, I can't remember what the other town was.
Worth, yep.
Worth, okay. Worth should still acknowledge that in their plan and say, hey, we have this joint court agreement, and that court resides in Lorraine, and we will coordinate with them and with the town of Lorraine for any of these types of provisions. I think that's probably the best way to couch it, because Worth really doesn't own the court. They have a joint use agreement, but it's not theirs.
Thank you. We have a few other towns with that situation too, so that'll
Okay.
come in handy.
Good. Let's see. So yeah, we have the contact tracing thing. We also have this last provision, which I'll say I understand it. I can agree with it to an extent, but I'm not wild about it. This is where Tim's opinions don't necessarily represent those of the Tug Hill Commission. There's this provision in the law for identifying emergency housing for employees. We have seen a similar circumstance. And so, of course, the law provides zero context for this. So it has left a lot of people guessing, like, why and to what extent would we ever need something like this? Really, the most likely scenario here is that, so we'll say Bob. Bob works for your town. Bob is an essential employee of your town. Bob's wife is symptomatic with whatever the disease du jour is. Bob is an essential employee of your town. You need Bob to come into work. So unless Bob has a place to stay where he can be safe, you may want to consider putting Bob up someplace. Generally, we're looking at hotel, motel, something like that. This has caused a lot of jurisdictions, especially small towns, to raise an eyebrow, immediately thinking cost. The law doesn't care about how much this costs you. I'm going to be completely honest with you. The law doesn't care. It doesn't address anything with cost or anything like that. Now, I'll also say that this might not necessarily completely rest on you. However, the law still requires you to identify protocols for identifying this housing and coordinating this housing for your employees if needed. Yes, you could be doing that on your own. You could also be asking the county, coordinating with, again, county emergency services, county health. They might see, hey, there's a big need in the county. They cut contracts with a couple of hotels in the county, and they help support some of that. Of course, if it's a declared public health emergency, it's probably a federally declared emergency, which means that you're eligible for reimbursement for certain eligible expenses from FEMA. But of course, that's going to come, long time down the line. I know in some cases that is not an easy pill to swallow, but nonetheless, that is the concept. Have we seen it in practice? We have, though I'm not aware of it. Actually, I've heard some rumors of it being in practice by a couple of municipalities in the state, but I haven't confirmed that. But I do know that early in the pandemic, the State Power Authority, they identified, from what I heard, upwards of like 30 employees who they identified as essential employees. And I think in different locations around the state, I think these were like dam operators or something like that. It's very, very specific, and they needed to be there. The Power Authority said, hey, you are so absolutely essential. We're not going to have you mingling with anyone else up to and including your families. Here's where we're going to put you up. You are only going to ever be there in your car or at work. You're not going to be physically seeing anyone else. We're going to have groceries delivered to you, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they decided to do. And I think they did that for a span of like 3 weeks. Again, of course, the cost issue, they have pretty deep pockets. So that was less of an issue for them. There could be some other arrangements. You may have a college in your area, community college, university, whatever. And there could be an arrangement to utilize their dorms. That could be low or no cost. That would be great. We have had people say, well, gee, we could just, throw a cot in the corner and they could stay at town hall. No, unless you have a shower and a way for them to store and prepare food, probably not. That's very undesirable. That would kind of really be like a last type of consideration. Really what I'm putting to folks is like, look, if you want to consider an alternative to a hotel or motel, you at least have to look at what we have as established standards for like emergency shelters. And shelters require showers. They require, food, whether they can prepare their own food or have it delivered. Obviously an area to sleep and restrooms and that kind of stuff. So yes, while you might want to think of some creative solutions to that, even if the lodging is outside of your town, that's probably what you want to go with.
Tim, question related. Oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
Question related to that. If the hotel is half an hour away, because that's the nearest place that's identified, does the town or village have to pay the travel to and from?
The plan doesn't address that. Like I said, the plan addressed nothing at all about cost. That would be between you and the employee, or you and the employee's union, in terms of any kind of reimbursement. If you're big enough where you have a vehicle, maybe you can provide them with a vehicle to do that. I don't know. That's again, that's entirely between you and them.
Okay, thank you. I think that Jean has a question for you as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I think the question from Lions Falls is the village does not have their own court system. However, the village offices are used for the town court. Does their plan have to cover the town as tenants?
I would, let's see. I do have a similar situation with another set of clients. I'm actually working with both the town and the village, and they have that same situation. It's the town's court. If it is legally the town's court, the town is responsible for it, regardless of where it is. In the village's plan, similar to the previous court question we had, if the village is utilizing the town's court, they should acknowledge that, and certainly even go to the extent of acknowledging in the plan that the town's court is in our building. So that still requires all this coordination between these different entities to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Awesome. Okay. And then a follow-up question to that is also from the Lions Falls. There are tenants that use our village office space for their own business separate from our village. Do those tenants need to be included in their plan?
Are these private businesses?
It says their own business.
Okay.
Separate from the village. So I'm assuming that it would be a business. Yeah.
I would say that they don't necessarily need to be included in the plan, at least in terms of you're not regarding them as your own employees or anything. But if there is like an access issue or something like that, where, if those tenants maybe don't have an outside access, they have to get in through the main door, but only, your employees can let them in. That's something that you may need to identify and address. And I think it's probably appropriate to address in the plan, especially when you're talking about employees working remotely or staggered shifts, that kind of thing. So yeah, there might be a need to identify that. There could also be a need to identify that in terms of minimizing employee exposures, to say that, hey, employees are only going to use this one entrance, which the businesses don't use, or, it's something else, whatever it is. I don't know, again, the exact circumstances, but that is something I'd be asking a lot of questions on, to say, okay, describe to me what this physical space looks like, what the interactions might be, what the access is, that kind of stuff, to really figure out, okay, with the intent of this law and what the plan should address, what do we need to identify in that plan?
Thank you.
Certainly. So aside from the content requirements in the plan, there are some administrative requirements. First of all, for those of you who do have labor unions or some type of labor management committee, the draft plan needs to be submitted to them within 150 days of the signing of that law. 150 days brings you to Thursday, February 4th, 2021. That's coming up pretty soon. And I have some late engagement clients who I'm really pressing to get through this process, because February is going to come up really soon, and at least a couple drafts of this plan need to be kicked around before it's ready to go to the labor unions. So it needs to go to them for their review and comment if they want. This is not an approval piece, just to put that out there. Labor unions don't have to approve this, but they may be reviewing this, certainly in their interest of employees. They may be looking at this from the perspective of making sure that there's nothing in there that violates any collective bargaining agreements or anything like that. They may or may not provide some comment. The law states that they are provided, quote, a reasonable amount of time to provide comment. What's a reasonable amount of time? Any attorney that I ask just kind of shrugs their shoulders and chuckles, because there's no provision in the law for what, quote, a reasonable amount of time is. We're recommending at least 2 weeks. I think that should be pretty adequate. So whatever form that they might be providing questions, comments, remarks in, the law also requires that the public employer provides written responses to those comments before they finalize the plan. They may or may not make any changes to the plan based on those comments, but still have to provide written responses. That is a requirement. And then let's see, finalized plans have to be published. There's a few requirements here for how they are published and posted. They have to be published in a conspicuous location for personnel to access. So we'll take a look at that one first. My general guidance on this has been, every place has the big employee bulletin board that has stuff on minimum wage and OSHA and unemployment and maybe some health insurance stuff. We all have that bulletin board. That's where I would put this plan, with a written across it, do not remove. It should also be included in employee handbooks if you have an employee handbook. Of course, if everyone has already issued their handbook, then you would give this to them as a supplement to that handbook. If you don't have a handbook, you don't need to, but the law does say if you do have one, it should be included in there. And then also, generically, it should be on the internet. The law states something akin to it should be on the internet in a location accessible to employees. So if you have an intranet of some sort, then yeah, that's probably a good place for it. If you don't, then basically your jurisdiction's website is where it would go. So those are all the requirements in terms of actually publishing and posting this plan. Lastly, there's this big caveat in there that the law has, that the plans that we're writing have, saying that basically this plan is not going to conflict with anything else that's out there. Or if it does, obviously that's an unintentional thing. So it can't conflict with any laws, regulations, et cetera, can't conflict with collective bargaining agreements or anything like that. So this is not licensed to flex your collective bargaining agreement because you don't like something that your union has in there. You still need to comply with all that. So that's an important part. They do also mention in here grievances. So separate from you, I will actually take a couple steps back here when it comes to posting and publishing. You are not required to send this plan to, quote, the state. Not the Department of Labor, not the governor's office, not the emergency management office, none of it. This plan does not get submitted to anyone else. This is something you are required to do, and you have it, and that's it. So long as you post it in accordance with what's there, that's all you're required to do in terms of posting. And of course, April 1 is the due date to have that posted by. Now they do include in this kind of some provisions on grievances. The law actually directs the State Department of Labor to establish a protocol, website, and hotline for anonymous reporting by public employees or contractors for any alleged violations of any law, rule, regulation, guidance, et cetera, involving a communicable disease. So it is not just for this plan, but it's for anything out there that involves a communicable disease. They can basically do an anonymous submission for that. The law also provides that no public employer will take retaliatory action against an employee for making suggestions or recommendations on the plan. And, as I have up here, enforcement with a lot of question marks, there is nothing in this law expressly addressing enforcement or auditing or anything like that. But the presumption is that because it would be under PESH's purview, that they would be the organization who would have the authority to do so. And they may. Don't know. There's an awful lot of laws out there, and we don't know what level of priority this is. I will say, as of a few weeks ago, just because I haven't really been needing to make sure that they've had it or not, as of a few weeks ago, the State Department of Labor does not have this protocol, website, or hotline set up for these for this. Not that I have seen. So they still have to. They've been directed to do so, but I've not seen it. And if it's there, it's buried. It's not anywhere on the public employer part of their site. Let's see. I do see someone that had raised their hand. I don't know if that was accidental or not. If you have any questions, just post them up in the chat. So I will actually break for any questions right now for anyone who might have them.
Tim, I just gave Lloyd the right to speak. So Lloyd, feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, please do. You just got to take yourself off mute there, Lloyd.
I wanted to make sure we're going to all get an email copy of this presentation when we're done.
I'm fine with that. I'm more than happy to provide it to the Tug Hill folks. And if you'd like to distribute it out, that would be appreciated, I think.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. My pleasure. Any other questions?
All right, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, sure thing. All right, so the tail end of this, first of all, some planning guidance. And of course, like I said, this is a mix of stuff from me, just simply as an experienced person who's done a lot of emergency planning, as well as established standards that are out there for this. There are 6 main steps when it comes to developing an emergency plan. The first one is assemble a planning team. Certainly understanding that a lot of you are probably small towns with not a lot of people. Try to involve somebody just to kind of make sure that it's not you. And the reason for this is that when it comes to emergency planning, we really try to look at things from different perspectives. We want to have some different thoughts and different ideas on things, because we always come into something with our own predispositions. And so it's good to get some of those different perspectives. Depending on your size, you may have some of your, obviously there's several different elected officials in the town that you can include. You might have finance people, you might have an HR person, you may have an IT person. Bring those different people in, because they're all specifically those different functions. You might not necessarily have one designated person for each of those. Maybe there's someone who does all of them. I don't know. But all those functions in particular certainly have some bearing on this plan. Labor representatives. The law doesn't require you to include labor unions or their representatives on your planning team, but it doesn't preclude you from it either. And it actually specifically states that in the law. So if you want to include them, you can. I will tell you, I'm working with some municipalities that right up front, they said, oh yeah, we want our union reps there because this is about, largely about their membership. And we see this as a big value. We have other municipalities who have said, no way, no how is there going to be a union rep on this planning team, because they're just going to be obstructionists. We don't have a good relationship with them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, either one is fine. In the end, if you have any employees who are union represented, they still have to, the labor union, a representative of the union, still needs to review this plan or be afforded an opportunity to do so. So you can't get out of that. But if you have a good relationship with the union and you want them to be involved in the planning, by all means. And then lastly, if you have a safety person, an emergency manager, whatever, maybe part of your own jurisdiction, they could also be counties. Every county has an emergency manager. They may call them something different, but there is New York State Executive Law Article 2B, which is emergency management law in New York State, requires every county to have this person who's responsible for emergency management. The Homeland Security might be in their title. Civil defense might still be in their title. But nonetheless, they are the people who do these things. From the county emergency managers that I've spoken to, a lot of them have basically said, hey, look, we have a lot of stuff going on. While we certainly appreciate being in the loop, we don't have the time to be part of these planning teams for every city, town, and village in our county. So you can certainly reach out to them if you want to. There's nothing that compels you to. But they're there. They can be a resource, and they may or may not have the opportunity to join you.
Hi, Tim.
Yes.
We have a couple questions related to this slide. The first one is from the Lewis County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Yep.
Are you aware that a soil and water conservation district needs to prepare this plan?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so the law does provide that if any jurisdictions, municipalities, basically anyone that's regarded as a public employer, which includes independent districts, like a soil and water conservation district, they would also be required to do this.
Okay, great. And the next question comes from the town of Wilna. Who is responsible for developing this plan? Is it the town itself, or will there be guidance from somewhere?
Well, definitely the town itself. This is basically one of those unfunded mandates from the state of New York, saying that everyone has to have this. And so there is that requirement to do that. In terms of guidance, I really think, and I'm not patting myself on the back, I think the lion's share of any guidance that has gone out on this has ultimately come from me and my company. I know that like the Association of Towns has sent some stuff out, which was based on a lot of the stuff I did, basically this presentation. And the Conference of Mayors also did something very similar to that. And that's not to say that I'm the only gig out there. We're also providing this as a service. It's you know, emergency planning is one of the things that my company does. So we're providing this out there. I've heard that there are some other companies that are providing this as a service as well. But yeah, ultimately, it's every public employer is responsible for doing this, however they get it done.
Tim, I've also in the chat put your website that has the template on it.
Perfect.
That's also a resource available to attendees and to communities.
Yes.
But ultimately, it is the town board, village board that ultimately is responsible for doing the plan, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, one more question, and this might be something to talk about later, but it's from the town of Champion, and they would like to know if you could address the protocol issues associated with snowplow drivers specifically. I know there's a lot of issues associated with this right now with all the snowstorms coming down the line, but and I don't know if you want to address it now or just wait to the end. How are you?
I think, you know, real briefly right now, I'm guessing that the issue largely is associated with the driver and the person who's operating the wing, both being in the same cab.
Yeah.
If that's a necessary operation for the town, then that's what they have to do. If you find that maybe it's not necessary to do and you don't have to have that second person in the cab, then obviously that's probably the best way to address it. If it is necessary, obviously making sure that they're both wearing masks and all that kind of thing. You know, all the provisions that are out there. Also, you know, if you have people who are using different trucks or who are using each other's trucks, you know, on the day, person A is in that truck. For the night shift, person B is in that truck. Person A should be wiping down all the, you know, touch surfaces in that truck, up to and including door handles and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's basically what I'll offer up for that.
And the other issue that's happening is that a highway crew, one person comes up with a positive test. They have to be quarantined, and or the other highway crew members need to be quarantined. That probably needs to be addressed in the plan as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've certainly seen through this pandemic a lot of practices where you have essential personnel who are exposed and or test positive, but are asymptomatic or at least largely asymptomatic, and you still need them to work. And we know that there's a lot of asymptomatic people who do test positive with this. And we've seen it in highway departments, police departments, fire departments, that kind of stuff, where we generally do need to, you still need them to work. That's a policy and procedure that we actually do identify in the plan template. And it's something that, again, everyone needs to kind of figure out on their own in terms of how they want to make that happen, if they are going to authorize it. You know, is there a liability with it? Yeah, there certainly is potentially a liability with it. But again, when these are essential services, we are finding, you know, that there's some necessity to it. That said, you can always have a contingency. We know that there's a lot of towns, we're working with a number of towns up in Clinton County, and they've developed basically a mutual aid agreement for public works, or for their highway departments rather. So if, you know, one department has lost, you know, one too many people because they have been symptomatic or they are trying to take extra precautions, they're helping each other out. You know, it's neighbors helping neighbors. So that's not necessarily, a provision like that isn't necessarily part of this plan, but it's certainly something that's identified as a best practice. used it in fire service forever. Mutual aid is a huge foundation of the fire service.
Great, thanks, Tim. One more question from the town of Wilna. They have the template, and the question is that simply a skeleton draft, or can that actually be used for this plan?
So I am putting the template up was I do a little bit of soul searching with that. I'm not a fan of templates in a general sense, because I've seen an awful lot of people basically change names and try to submit that plan, and not in this context, but in other contexts. And it gets to be very, very apparent, because you see references in the plan that don't make sense for that particular entity. So there's certainly a number of places in there where it basically says insert jurisdiction name here, but there are also other areas that require an awful lot of narrative to identify how you specifically, how your entity is going to deal with certain things, manage certain things, address certain things. It gets into that protocol. So yes, you need to spend some time with that. It's kind of a template / guidance. And so for those areas of narrative, I do provide guidance that say you should be identifying, these major themes within this narrative.
I think all of our communities can really appreciate your attempt at a template, but as you say, it's just a starting place and something that everyone needs to look at closely and tailor it to their own issues in their own town and or village.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Dan. Yeah, sure thing. So let's see, the second major step, first step was, again, put together a planning team. Second step in planning, understand the planning requirements. You may want to get your legal counsel involved in this to say, hey, we understand this is a requirement, maybe even, hey, this guy, Tim, gave us this template to look at. Do you think that this matches up? What do we need to do to make sure that we address all these needs? The third is then identifying the plan content areas, and that's kind of the yada, yada, yada of the planning guidance, because there's so much that's actually the crux of it. As I've basically alluded to before, make sure that every content area identifies who's going to do what, when, and how, who has decision-making authority, who has oversight. Make sure that your protocols make sense and can be implemented end to end, beginning to end. Reference positions, not names. And while the current focus, again, of this whole thing is COVID-19 or the coronavirus, the plan should be able to address any communicable disease. So you definitely want to ensure that. The fourth step here, provide that draft plan to labor representatives for comment if you have employees who are represented by labor organizations. If not, then you don't have to do that. And you have actually then a lot more time. Everyone still has that April 1 deadline for approval of this plan. If you do have labor representatives, you then need to be reviewing the comments or respond to them in writing. And then lastly, finalize and post the plan. April 1, 2021 is that due date. Post the plan as required, all those things that we mentioned before. Ensure that people know about the plan. Simply, a lot of people think that just, quote, posting the plan or whatever it is that they do with it is enough. Make sure that people pay attention to it. You may have, your highway superintendent has some responsibilities within this plan. If for some reason they weren't part of that planning process, they're probably not going to know. And so you want to make sure that you point it out to them and that they are prepared and ready to actually implement. Begin taking whatever actions to implement the plan. Surprise, we're already in a public health emergency. So technically, when this plan gets signed by your town supervisor or mayor, it already needs to be in effect. So there are certain parts of this plan that you need to already be doing when that happens. Task somebody to be responsible for maintaining the plan. Make sure that that is actually part of their job duties. They are the keeper of the plan. And make sure that you are meeting at least annually to review and update the plan. The law may or may not change, but some of those details that you put into the plan might, based on best practices, your own thoughts and initiatives, et cetera. Plans, again, like I said, I'm a very practical planner. Plans should be developed not just to meet the legal requirements, but to also address the actual intent of the law. It should be a usable, functional plan. Should maintain sufficient detail to be actionable while still having that flexibility, because again, we don't know what the specifics are going to be of the next public health emergency. Think about processes. So identify, again, that who, what, and when they're going to do things. So lay things out in steps if you need to. And as you mentioned before, coronavirus COVID-19 has given us a lot of guidance and standards, but that might not apply to everything else that's out there. Lastly, in terms of references, for emergency planning, there's two big references that I always go to. One is a FEMA document. It's called Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101 or CPG 101. And that's specifically oriented toward maintaining emergency operations plans. This is a type of emergency operations plan. They lay out a 6-step planning process, very similar to what I gave you. And they have in there an awful lot of planning guidance that you can use. Also, NFPA 1600, which is a standard on continuity, emergency, and crisis management. NFPA usually charges for their stuff. NFPA 1600 is available free from their website. You have to register on their website, and they will give you a digital copy, which is very heavily watermarked. But you can still access it. That said, while there is some different content in NFPA 1600 compared to CPG 101, when it comes to specifically planning, they pretty much mirror each other. So in CPG 101, you can get without any of those encumbrances. Planning resources, a little bit of a shameless plug here. Our website, epsllc.biz, and in the chat, the website's been provided in there in a couple of places. You'll see a link in there that directs you toward New York State Public Employer Mandatory Emergency Planning. And there's a little bit of narrative in there, quick summary of the requirements. We have that template in there. And we actually also have a pricing matrix down on there, which is subject to change. As time gets closer for the due dates, prices have been going up because obviously it's putting the crunch on everybody. So if in the event, like I said, we are not the only gig in town, but if folks are interested in engaging us to help you write the plan, again, that's what we do. So we're more than happy to provide that assistance. So with that, that's our presentation. So again, I'll take any other questions. And other than that, I appreciate everyone's time and attention on this.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
We did have Bob McKenzie from Lewis County, or Lewis County Emergency Management is on the webinar, and he offered assistance to any Lewis County communities that want him to review their plan.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
At this point, we don't have any other questions. So I would like to again thank you, Tim, for your time, and I'm sure there will be people that call you at the last minute looking for your guidance. And with that, since we don't have any questions, we would like to say thank you again and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tim.